You expected explosions, radar screens lighting up, missiles rising into the sky. But when U.S. aircraft entered Venezuelan airspace, nothing happened. No launches, no interceptions, no visible resistance. And that silence is the story. Because in modern warfare, the most decisive battles no longer look like battles at all. Power is no longer measured by what you destroy, but by what you prevent from ever being decided. Venezuela's air defenses didn't fail mechanically. They froze strategically. What you witnessed was not weakness. It was paralysis. A system intact on paper, armed on the ground, yet unable to act because acting had become more dangerous than inaction. This is what war looks like when the target is not missiles or radars, but the decision itself. If this sounds unsettling, it should, because this logic doesn't stop at Venezuela. It defines how power is exercised today. If you want to understand why wars are increasingly invisible, stay with me. Because to grasp what didn't happen in the sky, we first need to understand what changed in war itself. At first glance, the question seems simple. Why didn't Venezuela fire? They had radars, they had missiles, they had trained crews. On paper, Venezuela possessed one of the most layered air defense networks in the region. Long-range systems, medium-range coverage, short-range protection. A structure designed not just to detect, but to deny airspace. So the real question is not whether they could shoot, it's what shooting would have meant. In classical warfare, firing an air defense missile is a tactical decision, a response to an intrusion, a technical action triggered by detection and authorization. But modern conflict has quietly rewritten that logic. Today, every tactical action is also a strategic signal. Every missile launch is a political commitment, and every commitment locks a state into an escalation ladder it may not control. In Venezuela's case, the moment a missile left the launcher, the conflict would cease to be ambiguous. It would become explicit, binary, and irreversible. That single decision would compress time, eliminate diplomatic space, and force a confrontation between profoundly unequal systems. So, the problem was never hardware. It was decision cost. And once the cost of deciding exceeds the cost of not deciding, paralysis becomes rational. To understand why that cost has become so high, we need to step back away from Venezuela and look at how war itself has been structurally transformed. Then we need to rewind the clock. For most of modern history, war revolved around platforms. Armies measured strength in divisions, fleets, squadrons. Victory meant destroying the enemy's ability to fight by eliminating his forces faster than he could replace them. But that logic began to fracture in the late 20th century. The information revolution quietly rewired conflict. Sensors multiplied, data accelerated, communication compressed time. What once took hours now took seconds. And as speed increased, decision-making, not firepower, became the bottleneck. Wars like Kosovo, Iraq, and Libya revealed a pattern. Enemy forces were often still present when their command systems collapsed. Orders slowed. Coordination broke. Units waited for guidance that never came. The battlefield didn't disappear. Authority did. This marked a fundamental shift. The decisive point of war moved from geography to process, from where forces were located to how decisions were made, transmitted, and authorized. The center of gravity was no longer the tank or the missile. It was the decision chain connecting detection to action. Once that chain becomes fragile, possessing weapons is no longer enough. You can see everything and still be unable to act. And that shift set the stage for a new hierarchy of power. One where some actors don't just fight better, they decide faster, safer, and earlier than everyone else. Then the first crack appears. In this new hierarchy of power, the decisive blow is rarely loud. It arrives quietly, upstream, long before the first missile could ever be launched. This is where Venezuela's situation turns from theory into crisis. Because an air defense system does not act on its own. It waits, it asks, it escalates decisions upward, and in moments of extreme asymmetry, that escalation becomes lethal to the system itself. Firing at a U.S. aircraft is not a technical reflex. It is an act of sovereignty, a political declaration with irreversible consequences. Once the order is given, There is no pause, no diplomatic rewind. The state is committed, and that is precisely the trap. Under conditions of overwhelming informational pressure, electromagnetic disruption, intelligence, penetration, narrative dominance, the command environment becomes saturated, signals multiply, ambiguity grows, responsibility blurs. Every actor in the chain understands the same thing. If this goes wrong, there is no cover. So the order never comes. Not because leaders are absent, but because authorization itself becomes dangerous. This is the first mini-crisis. Not a battle in the air, but a rupture in confidence. A moment where initiative flips from advantage to liability, where action risks national catastrophe, and inaction feels survivable. If this dynamic feels deliberate, that's because it is. And to see why it works so reliably, we now need to look beneath the surface into the hidden mechanisms that make modern systems appear powerful, yet behave as if they are restrained from within. Then we arrive at the hidden layer. Because what neutralized Venezuela's air defenses was not firepower, but architecture. Modern military power no longer resides in individual systems, but in how those systems are connected, synchronized, and authorized to act. C4ISR is not a support function anymore. It is the system that defines what is visible, what is credible, and what is permitted. Venezuela's air defenses were fundamentally platform-centric. Sensors detected, radars tracked, missiles weighted, but every step depended on a centralized decision chain, one that required political clarity, institutional trust, and vertical legitimacy to function under stress. That chain was fragile. When political authority becomes contested, orders lose weight. When loyalty becomes uncertain, authorization slows. And when responsibility for escalation is ambiguous, the system defaults to caution. Not because officers are afraid of combat, but because they are afraid of owning a decision that could redefine the state's fate. This is where decision-centric warfare operates. It doesn't destroy command nodes. It surrounds them. It floods the environment with uncertainty, saturates the information space, and raises the political cost of action until every option feels strategically irrational. The system remains connected, but coherence disappears. Detection without decision, tracking without authorization, power without permission. And once a system reaches that state, no missile needs to be jammed or destroyed. The architecture itself becomes the constraint. This is not collapse. It is systemic deactivation. And the moment that deactivation sets in, the second crisis becomes inevitable, one that unfolds not in command rooms, but in the lived reality of those who must bear its consequences. Then the tension spikes, because once a system is deactivated at the top, the stress doesn't disappear. It travels downward. This is the second mini-crisis. At the tactical level, operators still see targets, screens still populate, alerts still trigger. Technically, the system is alive, but strategically, it is frozen. And that gap between perception and permission creates a dangerous pressure zone. Every second without authorization stretches the system thinner. Crews wait. Commanders hesitate. No one wants to be the first to act without cover. And no one wants to be responsible for escalation without certainty of backing. In this environment, speed becomes a liability, not an advantage. Meanwhile, the opposing side is not waiting. An integrated C4ISR ecosystem compresses time on its own terms. Space-based ISR, cyber access, electromagnetic dominance, and human intelligence fuse into a single operational picture. Decisions are rehearsed before they are required. Escalation ladders are mapped in advance. What looks like restraint on the surface is actually preemption at the decision level. This asymmetry is crushing. One side must decide in real time, under ambiguity. The other has already decided in advance, under clarity it engineered. So the tactical edge evaporates. Air defense crews become custodians of assets they cannot employ. The system is present, but irrelevant. Not defeated, outpaced. And when this gap between capability and permission becomes visible, its consequences extend far beyond the military. Because the real cost of decision paralysis is not paid in command centers, but by the people living beneath them. Now the lens shifts to you. Because decision paralysis is not an abstract doctrine. It has a human footprint. When a state can no longer decide, uncertainty seeps into everyday life. You feel it before you can explain it. Prices fluctuate without warning. Rumors travel faster than facts. Authority speaks, but no longer convinces. And beneath the surface, a quiet realization spreads. Someone else is setting the tempo. For ordinary people, this kind of conflict is disorienting. There are no air raids to rally against, no clear enemy to point to, just a growing sense that the future is no longer being shaped locally. Decisions that once felt sovereign now feel deferred, delayed, or made elsewhere. This is the emotional cost of decision-centric warfare. It doesn't break cities, it erodes confidence. You begin to live inside strategic ambiguity. Waiting replaces planning, caution replaces initiative, and over time, that psychological weight becomes heavier than any visible show of force. If you've ever wondered why modern power feels invisible but overwhelming, this is why. And if this analysis helps you see what's happening beneath the headlines, share it. These dynamics matter because they don't stay confined to one country. Because once decision paralysis takes hold in one system, its effects don't stop at borders. They ripple outward, then zoom out. Because what happened in Venezuela was not an isolated episode. It was a signal. When a state's defenses are neutralized without a single visible strike, every other actor is watching and recalculating. Allies reassess guarantees. Rivals reassess red lines. Smaller states reassess what sovereignty even means in an age where decisions can be denied upstream. This is how decision-centric warfare reshapes geopolitics. It doesn't redraw maps, it reorders hierarchies. Power now flows toward those who can integrate space, cyber, intelligence, narratives, and timing into a single decision architecture. Those who cannot are pushed into reactive postures, forced to absorb strategic tempo rather than set it. Deterrence shifts from threat of destruction to threat of paralysis. The implications are global. Russian and Chinese-built systems are not defeated technically but conceptually challenged by architectures designed to bypass them. Escalation dynamics become asymmetric. One side risks everything by acting. The other risks little by shaping conditions. This creates a world where influence is exercised quietly, persistently, and often invisibly, where crises are resolved before they formally begin, and where dominance is less about battlefield victory than about controlling which options ever become thinkable. And once that logic takes hold, the future of conflict no longer hinges on who fires first, but on who decides last. Then we have to look ahead, because decision-centric warfare does not produce a single future. It opens three. The first is the optimistic path. States adapt. They decentralize command. They rebuild trust between political authority and military systems. Decision-making becomes more resilient, more distributed, harder to paralyze. In this world, decision superiority stabilizes into a new equilibrium. Conflict becomes rarer not because power disappears, but because escalation is managed with greater foresight. The second path is muddling through. Most states fail to fully adapt. Legacy systems remain platform-heavy, decision-light. Power concentrates in a few actors capable of shaping the decision environment. Crises multiply, but stay below the threshold of open war. The world becomes tense, brittle, permanently unsettled yet oddly quiet. The third path is darker. Decision dominance becomes absolute. A small number of actors learn not just to influence decisions, but to preempt the decision horizon itself. Political agency erodes. Deterrence collapses into paralysis. War doesn't disappear, it becomes structurally one-sided. And when resistance finally erupts, it does so irrationally, explosively, outside any controllable framework. Which path prevails depends on whether states understand what Venezuela revealed, that the decisive terrain of the 21st century is not airspace or territory, but the architecture of choice. And once that terrain is lost, regaining it is far harder than defending a border. So let's close where this began, with silence. Venezuela's air defenses never fired not because they were weak, but because war had already moved past them. The decisive action happened upstream before orders, before escalation, before a single missile could justify its own launch. This is the uncomfortable insight of modern power. The strongest actors no longer need to cross red lines. They shape the environment so that crossing them no longer makes sense. They don't win by destroying options. They win by making options disappear. That is the real meaning of decision superiority. And it matters to you, even if you never follow military affairs. Because the same logic controlling tempo, shaping choices, narrowing futures, extends beyond war. It defines how power works in the 21st century. If this analysis changed how you see conflict, share it. In the next video, we'll go deeper into how states can resist decision paralysis and whether true strategic autonomy is still possible. Because in an age where the battlefield is invisible, understanding it is no longer optional. It's the first step toward reclaiming the right to decide.